Yeah, welcome to No More Week 2024 and our tech conference. For those that have just joined us, this is our sixth session of the day, and you'll be able to see the previous sessions in the lobby via the pre-record. So at the moment, if you signed in as a participant. We are recording, but you will not be seen, and there is no need to turn off your microphone or camera. The other thing to say is what we will talk about today could be triggering. We are very sort of digging into the depth of unsolicited images and deep fake pornography. If you do feel that you need support, there'll be information about the global directory inside the chat. Please reach out. There are advocacy agencies across the world ready to support and offer you help. So I get the pleasure of introducing my most incredible, phenomenal panel, who I'm very grateful has joined us from the UK and from the US, and some really early in the morning and others in the UK from a little bit later on, just before lunch. So let me first start with Adam, and I love your description that you are the founder of NTAB, and Adam is a digital safety futurist, advocate and speaker, who's very much focused on raising awareness around the issues of online harm and abuse. Lindsay Emsong is the program director of the Family Law Project in Queens and at Sanctuary for Family, and Sophie Mortimer is the manager of UK Revenge Porn Helpline and the stopncii.org platform, which has been developed between SWGFL and Meta, which allows any adult around the world to protect their images from sharing and resharing across platforms. And I know Sophie will go into a lot of details about that later, about how to access it and what support is provided. So we're here to talk about a topic which we all sort of know about to some degree. We're starting to learn more about. We are hearing, sadly, about friends or family members or celebrities who are experiencing either deepfake pornography or unsolicited imagery. But I think one of the key things in many ways is to start with, how do we define this? What names and what do we call things? Because I think one of the things that's always key is that when we talk about it, we in the sector, or if you're working in the space, we're quite flippant with our terminology. So I'm going to jump to you first, Adam. If you just want to give us as much information as you can about the term of deepfake pornography, that would be brilliant.
Sure. So the way that we think about deepfake pornography or non-consensual synthetic images is really this idea that victims are inserted into sexual videos without their consent. It's a form of face swapping, and it co-opts a victim's body. So you can make it appear that somebody has appeared in a video engaging in sexual acts that they never actually appeared in. And it's when you think about violence against women, for example, which this really is an instrument of violence against women. It primarily targets women and girls. Violence against women is so much about power and control, and this technology is really about power and control. It's about exerting power and control over the bodies of women and girls online and making them engage in acts that they never engaged in. And this can be a very violating experience to be sexualized and fetishized online. And really, as we'll get into, the form of trauma that results is still being navigated, because it's such a hard and challenging thing for a victim to get their mind around.
Sophie, could you give us a little bit of sort of your feedback about how you would define unsolicited images?
Well, to follow, I agree with everything that Adam has just said. I think actually we often talk about synthetic content rather than deep fake itself. I think that term has originated, I think it was a subreddit somewhere by a creator of this content. So, that feels slightly uncomfortable. And I think that there's quite a range of technologies that are used to create this sort of content now. So, and also then how it's used. So we tend to refer to synthetic content, but we're talking about a whole range of behaviors and technologies that cross over and overlap to create a whole range of problematic issues which seem predominantly to impact upon women.
Mm-hmm. And Lindsay, just so that we're knowing all the language that we're sort of using, how would you refer to unconsensual image sharing? Because I think that's something that is connected to this topic and often overlaps and blurs and is all intertwined, but I think it's great if we can name it too.
Absolutely. So many folks may know this term as the very victim blaming, and I will only say it once because I know everyone on this panel also agrees. The term revenge porn, which is a term that advocates, and we've been encouraging law enforcement, legislators, really society to go away from that term because it's image-based abuse, non-consensual image sharing. Online image abuse. There's different terms that refer to it, but really it's the non-consensual sharing of intimate images without someone's permission. Although I will add that, one thing as I have grown in this movement and worked with international counterparts, that image abuse is actually broader than simply intimate images. That's what we see it often as. That's what it's often criminalized as, and what legislators see it as. But I would just note that, of course, there are other forms of images that can be really damaging and dangerous to folks, particularly, in different cultural or religious backgrounds. If there's images that are shared without their consent, without them, showing a certain body part of their body, or within a religious or cultural community, that could be extremely dangerous to them if their, images are being shown of them, even in a bikini, or something that's not something that existed. Either, that could be a deep fake or a synthetic image, as Sophie so rightfully pointed out, or an actual image. And really we're referring to the consent is in the sharing of the image. So this is a really important point that I'm sure I know this panel I'm preaching to the choir on, but for those that may not know about this issue, many images are created with consent, right? People share images in the context of a relationship, right? I'm an intimate partner violence, domestic violence attorney, and many of my clients over the course of their relationship shared images with their partners consensually, when things were okay, when things were good, and yet those images were later weaponized to them. So consent is at the point of dissemination or sharing, not necessarily at the point of taking the image, although of course, taking images without consent would be another layer of non-consensual image sharing.
I mean, that's just brilliant. I think for those watching and being able to sort of dig into those terms, because actually when you then want to tell somebody what your experience is, knowing the language that perhaps other people will recognize can be really helpful. So just sort of going back to synthetic images in some ways, I think this is a sort of a question for all of you, is that what are the different forms? Because I think, for somebody who's just coming to the session who may not know, we learn a lot from the media. We learn a lot from what we're sort of seeing. And often if it happens to a celebrity or somebody who's of prominence, we're learning from their experiences. But I think, like, what are the different forms? And I think I'd really love it if we could just spend a moment and really sort of dig into how it impacts an individual's privacy and well-being. So I think, Adam, I know you mentioned earlier, Sophie, would you like to start, and then Adam follow, and then Lindsay?
Absolutely. I think I've worked in this space for about 8 years now, and the evolution of behavior and impact has been fascinating and disturbing, quite frankly, to watch. Certainly 8 years ago when I started this, people thought about intimate images being shared without consent in the context of a breakdown of a relationship. It was a heat of the moment incident. But that's certainly one part of what we see. But of course, there is so much more going on. Often it's not the heat of the moment, it's the culmination of months, weeks, years of abusive dynamics within a relationship that has then ended or might actually still be ongoing. We also see stalking and harassment contexts. We see, interestingly, some of what Lindsay referred to around images that might not meet a legal threshold of an intimate content, but certainly in that context of that person's privacy and well-being, would certainly impact on them and their lives to a huge extent, and those cultural and religious backgrounds. But we're seeing intimate images used in sextortion, either for more intimate images that can then be used to extort yet more extreme content, or for money. And there's some other sort of stalking, quite disturbing behaviors, and obsessive collecting of somebody's personal data. Could be, we see content shared alongside email addresses, social media handles, mobile phone numbers, and that puts people at very deep risk of online abuse and harm, but also offline harm.
I mean, Adam, you spoke quite eloquently yesterday when we chatted about the feeling of body autonomy. I've practiced that word. You want to just allude a little bit more to that?
Sure. The thing about it's interesting because on one hand, when a synthetic image, a synthetic intimate image is created and shared without someone's consent, in the abstract, people often think about this as, well, what's the big deal? It's not real, right? But then when it gets released, whether you see these synthetic nude images where photos of teen girls are edited via these AI-powered apps to digitally remove their clothing from the photo, or whether somebody is has their face swapped into a video where the victim is now portrayed to be engaging in sex acts. When people see this, when this happens, there is a visceral reaction to this, and people get very upset and start crying out for legislation and for us to do something. And I think, and I'm very interested in that, because in theory, people sort of question it, but when it happens, people are really taken aback. And I think a lot of this has to do with bodily autonomy, because our bodily autonomy does not end at a screen, right? People tend to focus on our bodily autonomy in the physical world, but really we are so well represented online that our bodily autonomy can and should extend to our digital selves. And when somebody co-opts our bodies online and violates our bodily autonomy, therefore by violating our consent and our boundaries and disrespecting our bodies, it makes sense that people have a visceral reaction to this, because it's violating sort of one of the most basic and things about being human, and losing control of our bodies should anger people. It should upset people. And I'm hopeful that the more this happens in the public eye, we can use this in our prevention and outreach efforts to help, let's be honest, young men and boys who tend to be marketed these apps to make informed decisions that, oh, wow, this isn't a funny thing to do. This is a really harmful thing, and I'm going to make an informed choice not to do it.
Lindsay, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, I know we were talking about, the impact on privacy and well-being and the experiences of folks who have experienced image-based abuse, deepfake images and unsolicited images. And I've been an attorney in New York for almost 10 years now, operating exclusively in the context of intimate partner violence, and working with individuals who have experienced image abuse and related forms of technology abuse. I think Sophie's point that, there's other forms of harassment, stalking, ongoing behaviors as a part of this is so critical, because I think folks sometimes don't realize that, especially folks new to this space, that it's not just, one image or 5 images, or it's even not just, even if it is 100 images, it's not just that. Also, the term just, I don't mean to dismiss, because even one image can be really life ruining for people. But it's on top of that, it is often as a part of a pattern of repetitive behavior, of calling, of text messages, social media, contacting folks' workplaces, their friends, their family, even their children. I have had a number of clients whose abusers have threatened to release images to their children, to say, I'm going to bring this to court. I'm going to show everybody, I won't, use the terms that were stated, but really horrible, disgusting, victim blaming, shaming terms. And I'm going to get full custody of our children. And I did exactly that, actually brought photos into the courtroom, waved them around the court, showed them to the judge. And this happens to folks. I mean, this is absolutely happening. I've had people walk in with pictures, really, you think that some kind of old fashioned type, things don't happen. But I had a person quite recently whose abuser had printed out photos, and plastered them all over her neighborhood, put them up on street signs near, her religious institution, the apartment building where she and her family lived. They were all up at 4 a.m. trying to take them all down. There are so many ways in which this is absolutely life ruining for people. I really cannot overstate the impact on individuals who are experiencing this. And so often I speak to folks, I work at a walk-in center here in New York, and people coming in saying, I've tried to tell my employer, I've tried to tell my friends, my family, law enforcement, judges, et cetera, and nobody understands, how horrible this is. We know from research that people who experience forms of technology facilitated abuse, including forms of image-based abuse, of which deepfake pornography is a growing portion of that, deepfake image abuse, that many of those folks contemplate suicide, and many of them have extremely high levels of emotional distress, 90% plus in some studies, over half plus in other studies contemplated suicide or even committed, not to, trigger warning. I know this is a tough conversation to be discussing, but I think it's so critical to really underscore the absolute impact on people's lives, that this is not just, one piece of it. It's absolutely engaging in their communities. It is, and as we know, we're carrying around our phones, our laptops, you are connected to it all the time. It's in your pocket, it's in your backpack. It's when you're laying in bed asleep with the lights off, looking at your phone. It is the most intimate and invasive way when somebody is really harassing you and overwhelming you in these ways. And I just think it's so critical that everyone here, and again, I know our panelists and No More are so great about understanding this, the absolute impact on folks' lives, and really taking it as seriously as, quote unquote, offline abuse or in-person abuse is, not being as serious. Oh, it's just, online. I run a task force here in New York that we have folks from out of the state, and we always run a conference. Usually there is no offline is kind of the tagline, because there really is not. And the impact cannot be overstated.
I mean, I'm going to definitely borrow that, because I think it really resonates with the fact that we now, all of us, regardless of which generation we were born in, or if we were born with mobile phones, not, however it is, we live our lives online. And so much of ourselves we put out there. And I think it comes back to that real question about when you tell somebody, how that response can make that big difference. I mean, my next question was quite sort of, without giving away any facilities you can, or any apps or anything, but how easy is it to create this? Because I think that's something that I would say is probably misunderstood, that you would need to be an expert in technology to be able to manipulate imagery and stuff like that. Sophie, do you want to go and answer?
Sure, and that's definitely something that we've seen changing so fast, particularly in the last couple of years, that 5, 6 years ago, some of this technology, you needed to have some tech ability, but now that's just simply not the case. And the proliferation of apps and software that's so easily accessible, it is really quite astonishing and very concerning. We had a case fairly recently that came into the helpline of a young woman who was only 18, and she'd previously had some harassment from a boy in her year at school, who had created accounts impersonating her and was having conversations with other boys who thought that they were going out with this girl because they had a whole relationship online with her. But then when she was 18, she discovered that he was creating synthetic intimate content of her, which he was sharing with numerous people through this Instagram account, and that was hugely violating for her. But it just showed that it was so easily accessible for him. There's a review site for adult content, and it has a whole page, and it lists, last count a couple of days ago, 62 different websites that you could easily go to create the content of your choice of any sort of style. It's all there. Plus nudification apps freely available on app stores that you can just download to your phone right now. This is hugely violating. They have no other purpose, and most of the software also only works on women. It doesn't work for men. Funny that, isn't it? And it's just deeply violating to that removal of bodily autonomy and seeing what looks like your body doing something that you've never done. I think that's disempowering in a really fundamental way for people. But yeah, I think we should all be concerned at the way this technology is running wild and completely unregulated and uncontrolled.
I mean, I suppose there's two pieces in there, and I'm sort of leaning into what you were saying earlier, Adam, about how we equip the young men and boys in around preventing and knowledge, and what can we be saying as parents and teachers and caring adults around young men and boys about not doing this. And what are your thoughts on that, Lindsay?
I mean, I think that it's such a critical lesson that I think we often forget. And not to go too far afield, but the patriarchy hurts everyone, and it hurts men and boys, it hurts girls, it hurts the LGBTQ. I mean, it hurts literally everyone. And this idea that commodifying and objectifying bodies and women's bodies and the bodies of girls and young people is so damaging, not just to those whose bodies are being identified and objectified, but also to those doing the objectifying, right? And, you know, I work, like I mentioned, in the intimate partner space. So of course, the relationships that I see are almost exclusively, you know, abusive relationships where there has been this dynamic of power and control. And that is so much a part of that dynamic, which often comes from, you know, abusers, folks who are in a situation who have themselves often been, you know, have experienced abuse or have experienced some form of trauma in the past. And I think, you know, critically kind of engaging at that moment of, you know, reframing. And I know Adam has, I've attended several of Adam's trainings on these issues. I know he does a lot on this area. So not to punt it to him in a moment, but it's so critical to get into schools. I know, and increasingly so many school educational institutions, you know, community institutions. I'm speaking at a school later this week. It is so important that we have these conversations early and often with our young people, and really discussing, you know, the impact, especially of, you know, Gen Z and even Gen Alpha being online and just absolutely living their experiences online in ways that those of us who grew up, you know, with even flip phones, you just have absolutely no, you know, concept of. So I will pass it over because I think that all of our other panelists have such great things to say on this as well.
Adam, please.
Yeah, I mean, what can I add to that? Well, I often get asked, how can we prevent this? How can we prevent synthetic? And I really want to just hat tip to Sophie that getting away from the term deepfake pornography, I think, is really important, because sort of like in the same way we get away from revenge porn, right? Deepfake, some dude on Reddit created that term and now we all use it. And I don't think victims really, I know victims don't like to be identified with the term deepfake or pornography, right? As part of their trauma, being identified as being in pornography is in itself re-traumatizing. So I love that we have this opportunity at the outset to talk about, reframe this early, as opposed to, I mean, it's quote unquote early. This kind of abuse has been around for a while, but calling it, you know, synthetic image abuse, or finding another term to describe this abuse, I think is really important if you want to be victim and survivors centered, which of course we do. But I get asked a lot, how do you prevent this? How do we prevent this? And from a technological standpoint, you know, there's no way to prevent this. People are creating these images, either, you know, as Sophie said, the nudification apps where you literally upload a photo, push a button, and it renders that person in the photo depicted in the photo nude, almost exclusively women and girls. Video, you know, face swapping videos, people are using totally benign content. And so what I lean into is prevention through outreach and education and talking to young men and boys, because we couldn't be making it easier to create these things. It's point and click violence against women, right? You can literally use your finger on an app to move a victim's face from a photo onto a person engaging in sex acts in a video. And when you've got youth who are being marketed these apps, and their brains are still developing and they are prone to impulsivity, this seems like just they're not even really thinking. And so we really, and they're not hearing about this technology from trusted adults or teachers or parents. They're hearing it from their friends and social media and the internet. And we don't want those sources guiding our kids, right, on what is healthy, what is safe, what is respectful to do. And so it's an opportunity. And to Lindsay's point, like, I talk in schools as well, and it's been heating up, asking me to come and talk about this stuff, because people are starting to realize, oh my gosh, like, this is not going away. And the future of this type of abuse is even scarier, which we can get into later. But it's not, you know, we're going to talk about nudification apps and face swapping as sort of ancient technology, because newer technologies that exist now, it's going to be that much easier to create these things and exert power and control over women's bodies. So definitely think outreach and education is the path to preventing people from misuse, from creating, sharing, and viewing this content. Because that's the other thing. You may not create it, you may not share it, but just viewing it is problematic. And you need, from a bystander standpoint and an allyship standpoint, because let's be honest, it's going to be mostly people that look like me that are creating and sharing these things. And so, you know, you need to speak out and call this out for what it is, which is sexual violence.
Sophie, I know that, well, your organization has been at the forefront of this. I mean, you started in that space of talking to parents about what was happening online, and obviously you've grown and grown in your prevention. What are you doing in the UK, particularly around this?
I'm afraid I'd have to say probably not enough. And I completely agree with Adam about education. And I think we need to have something that's really joined up between parents and schools and young people, because we put a lot of pressure here on schools to talk to young people. And then we also talk a bit to parents that they should talk to, but it's not joined up. And actually, I think a lot of parents are scared to have these conversations. It's not just about how you behave around somebody's intimate content, but about pornography in general, about relationships. We need to be having frank conversations with young people, because if we don't, they will go to an adult site and that's where they will learn. And clearly none of us want that. And unfortunately, we've seen enough impacts of that in the UK. So yes, our organisation have been very proactive about going into schools and talking about online safety. And we do have a resource that was developed by one of my colleagues around pornography and talking about the history of pornography and what does it mean, and trying to develop some critical thinking. But I think there's still a lot of resistance in schools, and that's what we need to push about. But I think we need to do that by involving parents in this conversation, so that both sides are singing from the same hymn sheet. Parents feel supported by schools and schools feel supported by parents, because we're all this village that are raising these children. And as a parent myself, I wish they'd been a bit more joined up for mine. I think I got through by the skin of our teeth, but there was definitely much more we could do. And with more availability of this content and technologies to abuse this content, we just need to be talking much more openly than we have been.
Absolutely. No, I think you're spot on. I think you are right. There's often this disconnect between, if I don't understand something, I won't have a conversation with my young person in my life and I'll steer away from it. Or if I don't understand and someone confides in me that this is their experience, I will brush it away and not really, appreciating the impact that has on silencing someone and moving that situation to somewhere else. I think, we've spoken a little bit about responsibility, and then this is a big question and probably quite a optimistic question, so I own that, is that do we have any opportunity to work alongside the tech companies to promote sort of an ethical response to AI development in this space? Are they listening when we're talking to them and feeding stuff back? I know, Sophie, I feel like I want to direct that question to you first and on from there.
I think the answer is, are they listening, is yes and no. I think some are listening, some are not listening, and some are not interested in listening, which I think is yet another challenge. Obviously, the space that we work in is around non-consensual intimate imagery. We have Stop NCII that we developed with Meta to help people protect themselves online from the sharing of their intimate content without ever losing control of it or feeling that they've had to share it with anyone that they didn't want to share it with. Hashes are created on their own devices. So we've tried to think in a very privacy-centered way, a very victim survivor-centered way. So I can say that some in industry are listening. We have some really big players who are part of that project, but there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of sites out there, and many of them operate differently. And I think a lot of them are quite happy to trundle along under the radar and let the big names do the heavy lifting. But actually, they're not always where the harm is. But in the UK, it's always Facebook. It's always, are Facebook doing enough? Has Facebook done enough? Where are the problems at Facebook? Well, to me, I'm not saying that they haven't got more that they could do, but they're not the big problem. The problem is the hundreds upon hundreds of middle ranking and small sites who are hosting, sharing, and resharing this content and just floating under the radar and not taking any of the heat. So I think we've got some work to do there to build some more positive relationships and compliance. And sometimes there are willing sites, but sometimes they may not have the resources actually for the moderation teams that are required or the technology that's required to onboard all of these systems to keep people safe. It's a landscape that we've kind of left to its own devices for quite a long time, and I think now there's support needed there, and that has to be a two-way street if you want to get some more goodwill and good conversation and better outcomes for people.
Absolutely. Lindsay, what are your thoughts on that? What more can we do to engage these companies?
I mean, I completely agree with Sophie that it's very um, skewed kind of our responses that we get from different companies. And I know that everyone on this call, I know many of us are in these spaces and, working at, for instance, the National Network to End Domestic Violence Tech Safety Summit, where, and no more obviously, and there's a Deepfake Summit that the Reclaim Coalition and Joyful Heart is holding in the next couple of weeks as well, with different, kind of ambassadors from different organizations. But there are some that appear and some that don't, and also different levels of engagement, right? So we have, I think the importance of having a panoply of options, a whole toolbox for folks to utilize, because talking to folks on the ground, there are some things that are really helpful for some folks and not for others. For example, stopncii.org is a fantastic tool, especially like if people have access to their images. It is probably the number one, if only, preventative tool that I have to give to people who come in and say, I'm worried that my ex is going to post these images online. And I asked, do you have the images? Do you know which ones this person has? They say, I'm like, great, you can upload them, create this hash value. The images are not stored. They're not, actually shared. It's created this, this code, which is fantastic, 100%. Where it cannot, unfortunately, just by the function of it, cannot help is when folks don't know what images are being shared, or there's images that are being created of them. So I think the importance of building on the fantastic success that stopncii.org has been able to create with Meta, with all of these partners, into other tech spaces, into digitized and synthetic images. I would be remiss in not noting that there has been an absolute, outpouring of laws addressing these types of synthetic image sharing issues. I think in the last year, I know that New York, we added it on it, and there's 10 states that now have digitized images that are crimes or have some form of civil liability in their states. And I also understand that the UK also recently added synthetic images as well, which I'm sure that was like, shout out to Sophie, I'm sure that was you. And the importance of bringing attention to these issues and putting them into legal sections, not just, criminalizing the behavior, which is one option, right? Folks can go through, but again, I don't want to speak to folks who may not be as familiar with this issue, but there's a lot of problems with people reporting, and the people who may not want to report. They don't want to bring in their nude images and show it to, or even synthetic nude images and show it to the police or judges, et cetera. That's a great option, but it cannot be the only option. So the importance of having laws that address, that allow for redress and accountability, and also for civil suits potentially, but also addressing it on, before these images are created, or even as they are created, preventing the spread of them. Why can we not regulate? And we do, we've been starting to, regulate these things as we do in other consumer products, right? There are dangerous products, there are dangerous, images. We know how to deal with that, right? That's been something with, child pornographic images that we've been dealing with for many years. So we know that there are these forms of technology that have been utilized, and the importance of just spreading that and supporting survivors who are experiencing this form of abuse in other spaces.
Adam, what are your thoughts? I'm going to pop back to the legislation in a minute, because I think that's a whole interesting way for our discussion to go forward, but I want to give Adam a chance to respond.
Yeah, the one thing, I don't have a ton to add. I'll just say that tech companies, when you talk to them about synthetic images, they're focused on the misinformation piece and detection. So they want to, their reaction is, how do we prove a synthetic image is in fact a synthetic image and not a real image? And the problem with that approach is it really fails victims of synthetic image abuse, because no one cares that they're fake, right? That they're not, I shouldn't say fake, that they're not real images, that they're synthetic images. If you go to these sites, these quote unquote deepfake pornography sites, they proudly identify as deepfake pornography sites. They're not fooling anyone. So if somebody in the tech industry came out with some detection tool to detect synthetic images or quote unquote deepfakes or whatever it is tomorrow or today, which doesn't exist, by the way, with 100% accuracy, those websites would continue to thrive. These nudification apps would continue to thrive, because this type of violence against women and girls isn't about misinformation or tricking somebody into believing what they're viewing is actually authentic. It's about power and control over women's bodies. And so I appreciate the position that technology companies are taking with detection, but it really doesn't move the needle for victims. I mean, it does in a sense. It's nice to be able to say, hey, this wasn't actually me. But in the overwhelming majority of cases that I work on, it's very well established that it's not a real video, that it's not a real photo. And yet the damage is, the order of magnitude of harm is devastating. And one of the ways that I explain that, and then I'll stop talking, but one of the ways I explain that, because, I'm taking this from a mental health professional, but when they first saw this was years ago, they said they watched a synthetic video where a victim was inserted into engaging in sex acts. And she said, this reminds me of somebody being raped or sexually assaulted while incapacitated or unconscious on video. So they have no memory of it, but then you watch it and you have to watch yourself being sexually assaulted. And that is a deeply traumatic and traumatizing experience. And this technology manufactures that and puts it in anybody's hands. And that is really frightening. And so I think it just helps when talking to tech companies to sort of explain what the challenge is, and that detection, while is a good thing to have, does not come close to moving the needle when it comes to this form of abuse.
Thank you so much. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is definitely space to do that, but I suppose really centering back into that survivor experience of this has happened. My first step will be I have to get somebody to believe that it's happened. And then one of my options going forward where I don't feel sort of re-violated by having to consistently, prove that this is happening to me. So I think, Lindsay, if I can jump to you and then perhaps Sophie, is just really to think about from the US perspective, we've spoken a lot about new legislation, which is fantastic. Brilliant. And across the whole, our sessions today, which were in Australia and India and Africa, we've also spoken about legislation that can support the conviction of synthetic, those that perpetrate using synthetic imagery. But what we consistently see is that legislation only works at the point of reporting and being believed, and then that response being consistent across the board. So yeah, Lindsay, and then if you want to respond to that, would be brilliant.
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, that is primarily a lot of the time when folks come to me, at least, when this has already happened, right? When people are, and that's again, because of my placement in working directly with survivors. And I think, again, it goes back to our previous conversation about the importance of training and outreach and education before these things are happening or before they're even coming into folks' minds. But once people have had this experience, the importance of, and I don't know who is on this call, but in this meeting, but thank you to everyone joining, because the importance of having all of us being, not bystanders, but active allies and working, even if you're not working in victim services, even if you're not, a lawyer or an advocate or a social worker or whatever it is, supporting your family and friends, supporting women, girls in your life, supporting children, people that come forward with this form of abuse, and helping them through the process. Because the number of and I think we can all, medical professionals, mental health professionals, teachers, all of us touch people's lives, throughout. And I cannot tell you the number of times I have worked with clients who have said, oh, I reported what happened, to my employer, at whatever, some, high corporate organization, or to my school where I am a student. And the responses they got were not only disappointing, but actively traumatizing, actively undermining their experience. We all have a role in supporting people, not just in enforcement, but if we as a society globally all had the response of, I am so sorry that this happened to you. It doesn't matter that it's a synthetic image. We know that the harm is still there. How can we support you? Let's get you safety planning options. Let's talk about your options in the legal context. Is this an intimate partner? Can you get an order of protection? In many places, you can get orders of protection. Even if you're not an intimate partner, there are some family court and civil court options for that, depending on your location. I encourage you all to look up that. I know there's a great directory that No More has already shared in the chat. And also, I will say that the New York Cyber Abuse Task Force, we have a manual with information that's, New York based, but also globally based. We have a lot of partners, that many of whom are on this call, and others with resources and information, legal options if people choose to go that route, how to promote reporting to law enforcement if that's what folks choose, and also the importance of trainings, not just in our schools, et cetera, but also in our communities, government, judges, prosecutors. That's something that I do a lot of in advocating to make sure that people are trauma informed and victim centered, survivor centered, so that when they do report, they're not given that response of dismissiveness or, oh, that's out of our jurisdiction, or, oh, it's just online, or, oh, you haven't. I mean, I heard last week, oh, well, you didn't actually meet this person, so how could it possibly be damaging when, you know, my client is getting thousands of messages, you know, contacts, phone calls to her work, but she, you know, hadn't met this person. So how could it possibly be damaging? We need to continue to work to dispel these responses to make people feel safe and comfortable in reporting, and also making that reporting helpful and meaningful to them.
I think there's a key thing in that, feeling safe when reporting. Sophie, what are your thoughts? I know you know, the essence of what you do is around supporting survivors.
Absolutely. And I always think legislation is really key, not just for its own sake and to criminalize and give hopefully some form of redress to victims, but it's putting down that cultural marker and saying we don't consider this to be acceptable. England, or obviously the United Kingdom, it's 4 nations. England and Wales brought in a whole change to the legislation around the sharing of intimate images without consent, which came into force on the 31st of January, which included synthetic content. So that was great. But Scotland, in fact, had criminalized synthetic content in this context in 2016. So they are ahead of the curve. Northern Ireland, not yet caught up, but there's been other issues going on there. But I do think it's a really important step forward. But Lindsay's point about bystanders, I think, is a really important one, because people aren't always able to take those steps themselves, and because we need a sort of a community response to some of these abuses. And I think there's something slightly different often that we see in the sharing of synthetic content of people as opposed to genuine, is that I think sometimes the drivers are quite different. The sharing of genuine content is often a behavior that's very much targeted at the individual, so that they know, that the people around them know, because that's where the power and the abuse and how they're going to get the impact that the perpetrator is looking for. But I think sometimes with synthetic content, that's around the possession of content, the creation of content, and sharing with peers. That's not about the target. And there was some research done towards the end of last year that said something like 94% of synthetic pornographic content was of celebrities. So that's just about the possession for whatever form of gratification that person wants it for. So of course the victims, celebrities or not, don't necessarily know that this content exists. So that's where we need to look to bystanders and to tech companies, and to a more collective response to identify this content and say that it is harmful, and say, yes, remove it, it is harmful. If somebody wants to come forward and say, yes, that's me, and I'm really happy that that's on your platform, that's another thing. But let's not just assume that it's okay until we're told otherwise. I think that's definitely the wrong way around.
Adam, what are your thoughts on this? Thank you so much, Sophie and Lindsay.
Yeah, I mean, from a legislative standpoint, I think I totally agree. It really legitimizes this as a form of, you know, sexual violence, which it is. I want to preach a little bit of caution, because we can't stop at the legislative piece, because I get asked this question all the time about laws and synthetic images. And I think, you know, laws are important, but they are less effective, and this is a very polite way of me of saying this, less effective if we can't enforce them, right? And the reality is, it's, I mean, in California, for example, one of the first states, if not the first state, to criminalize the sharing of intimate images without consent. Still incredibly difficult to enforce that law in California, and it's been around for a long time. So the idea that the instrument of enforcement is law enforcement, right? The instrument of investigation is law enforcement, and routine. I do a lot of trainings with law enforcement, and I can say this with 100% confidence. I have yet to meet or encounter a law enforcement agency that is appropriately staffed, resourced, and trained to address and investigate just cybercrime in general, much less, this new, sort of less well-known form of violence. And so alongside our legislative efforts, we also need to be empowering the folks that are going to be receiving these reports and investigating these reports to actually do their jobs and follow through. And then the last thing I'll mention is there's sort of three legs to the stool, in my opinion. There's legislation, there's enforcement, and then there's cooperation, right? Because very often the person that is creating, sharing these images is not located in the jurisdiction where the victim resides. And so that creates so many hurdles to get justice, and whether it's outside of the county, outside of the state, or outside of the country. I'm coming from a US perspective, it's very difficult. So we need a lot of cooperation and to set expectations that there are going to be bad actors who are located in jurisdictions where cooperation just isn't possible, right? And so it's really important to set expectations with victims and survivors of this type of abuse, that it may be a harm reduction approach rather than a criminal justice approach.
Thank you for that. I think, you touch on something that's really interesting, in that when we think about technology companies, they have a reach which is worldwide, and they are impacting on the lives of people across the world, and responses are different. And so when we think about a solution, often we think about it based from the UK, wherever we are living, we think about that's the response that's needed. And I think, one of the things that's been resoundingly said across all of our sessions and in all of our meetings is that a lot of the machine generated safety tools that big tech companies, small tech companies are using are often framed for a particular community or culture, and actually dismiss individual communities and cultures, on the basis that they're machine learning, and we need to think differently about how we think about safety. Just before we move on to the next question, I want to take this minute, and because I think you mentioned something which we've spoken a lot today about synthetic imagery and the fact that it's used in sexual violence or in pornography or in any of those pieces. But you mentioned something that I think was really, really important, was that actually synthetic imagery is used often as a tool of coercing, of controlling behavior, and by family members around perpetrating other forms of harm and taking things that are culturally frowned upon and implying that. Can we just take, Lindsay, would you mind expanding on that a bit? Because I think that's something that when we talk about the subject, we often stay in that sphere and don't actually recognize this as much as we can do.
Sure, and I'm sure others have also important things to add here. I know that one of my first interactions with synthetic images, probably 4 or 5 years ago even, was a case that we had where a client had synthetic images created of her, and she was from a very conservative community. And she and her, it was actually her family member who had created images of her that made it look like she was wearing fewer clothes, and these were distributed within her family and into her community. And she actually, trigger warning, she attempted suicide. She was ultimately okay, but this was so harmful to her. Just the fact that, again, it was not even intimate images under, and I say intimate in the parlance of what we talk about intimate. A lot of these images are intimate, right? For legal purposes, as a lawyer, unfortunately, intimate, often means referring to specific, genital or sexual parts. So I just want to clarify that although it may be intimate, defined, it's not intimate legally. And I think the impact of that, has really stayed with me for a long time on, that it's beyond, the creation of necessarily sexualized images or even images that are created by a partner. And I think to Sophie's point too, and to Adam's point as well, that, these images are not, although we know that the greatest, the very common form of harm is in the context of intimate partner violence relationships and dating relationships. This is happening. The vast majority of the images, especially the synthetic images, are not actually of folks in those relationships. They're of, they're just because the ease of creating them. So the importance of addressing the harm of these images, period, regardless of, who is distributing them, regardless of, in what context and what relationship and on what platform. I've seen some, I think, well-intentioned, but I think misguided efforts to kind of differentiate between dissemination and publication, or where is it being posted? Is it being sent to someone? Is it being posted on a platform? you know, and I think just the reminder of even if it's one time, even if it's to one person, even if it's, you know, on a text message versus on, you know, Facebook or on a major media platform, those images can, I mean, it's whack-a-mole, as you know, many folks have said for many years, the ease of that distributing. So focusing again, I think always bringing it back, and I really appreciate everyone on this panel constantly always bringing it back to the survivor experiences, always bringing it back to the impact, because so often I feel like that gets lost in, you know, the veracity of the images, or, well, how many are they being sent and who's doing it? You know, the harm is there regardless.
To mute myself. Yeah, thank you so much. Sophie, I mean, is there anything that you're doing from a response point of view that you'd want to share with us? Because you obviously have the helpline and you have the stopncii.org website. Can you just explain some of those? Because I think they're incredible resources. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Yes, with to go back to our terminology where we started, now that we're coming towards the end, as somebody who runs the revenge porn helpline, yes, language is really, really important, and we never use that phrase other than in the name of the helpline. So we do appreciate that it's problematic. But yeah, the helpline here is the core of everything that we do in this space. And I always tell that my amazing team who are picking up the phone every day, that it is what they are hearing and what our clients are telling us that is so important, and that is what has to inform everything that we then go forward to do, because that's what people are really experiencing. So that's what we're trying to tackle. So the helpline, you know, we're a small charity, and we support huge numbers of people, thousands of people every year in various ways. We can't always have enough people to answer the phone, so we have a chat bot so that people can access advice 24/7 and get to those resources that they need, because there is help available, and that's always what I'd want to leave people with, the message that there is support. For Stop NCII as well, it's so important that we hear what people directly affected are telling us, and because it's a global tool for people to protect themselves, we have a network of NGOs around the world. I think we're up to about 95, 96 different NGOs in countries around the world, and we speak to them regularly to understand what they're seeing. And I think there's a definite piece of work to be done around these other forms of intimate images, because of very real harms, to the worst sorts of harms that we can imagine that people can be exposed to from the sharing of images that might not meet some of the legal criteria that we currently have around this content. But we need to use Stop NCII to protect more people, protect more images in more countries and across more platforms. And so that's about engaging more platforms. So if you ever talk to a tech platform and they're not part of this program, please ask them why not, because there are no excuses. Yeah. It's very accessible. We help people get involved. It doesn't have to be particularly difficult for any platform, large or small. We will support them through that. But we need to get more hashes in there, and I'm really keen to find other ways of taking hashes from our other partners, rather than just the ones that people create themselves, because sometimes people don't know their content has been shared. So we need to find more creative ways of protecting people from the harms that are out there, causing damage day in, day out. So there is a lot that we can do, and it's all about collaborative working. It's working with NGOs. It's working with people like Adam and Lindsay, you know, lawyers, people going into schools and talking to law enforcement and talking to legislators and other NGOs and support services and governments and policymakers. We need to be having these conversations globally, because despite what the UK always say about wanting to be the safest place in the world to be online, we cannot do it on our own. We have to do it together, because this is the internet, and that doesn't work a country at a time. So I'm all for conversations like this, and working with anyone who wants to come and talk to me or will listen to me talk at them for a bit, because it's just all about collaborative working. And I just genuinely think that we can make some real difference. We're getting there. There's so much more to do.
In some ways, it feels like we're at the beginning, but also the middle of a moment where we could start thinking differently about how we respond. And I think the core piece is keeping us survivor focused and survivor centered, and ensuring that their voices consistently inform what we do. And like you rightly so, is that instead of looking this as an individual response, it's an entire community response. It's our parents, it's our teachers, it's us as individuals saying something and responding in the best way. It's us challenging the men and boys in our lives for watching. It's lots of stuff. But I'm going to ask you a question that came through in a way that Adam, that we spoke about with regards to what technology is available and what it can and it can't do. If we can't get detection tools, this came from one of our attendees, if we can't get detection tools, what could big tech do in their sort of technological response opportunities? The way of putting it.
So I'm so glad this question came in. There's one tech company that can really cripple the let's quote unquote deepfake porn industry, and that's Google, because 70% of these apps and websites are found through Google search. So if Google made the decision to treat synthetic intimate imagery shared without consent, like they do with child sexual abuse material and things like that, if they made it unsearchable, then those websites would die on the vine, because these websites hosting this content are not NGOs, they're for-profit businesses, and they rely on traffic, they rely on people paying them, they rely on advertising. And if we take away the economic driver for these websites, then they will cease to exist. And so one thing that we would highly recommend people do is to lobby Google to take that step, because they literally, that's a turnkey solution. They already do it with other forms of excluded content. They just need to treat this content the same way, and it will have one act will have an outsized impact in this field.
That's really key. Thank you so much for that. And I think one of the areas that No More has been really keen about doing is that networking and bringing people together. So I would say, with your support, Adam and Lindsay and Sophie, over the next couple of days, if not weeks, we need to pull something together so that we can enable people to put their name on a signature and do this work with Google. I think if one thing comes out of this conference, we were from No More would love to enable more and more people to find that space to challenge Google. So thank you so much for that. I will be in contact how we do that perfectly. We're coming to the end of our session, which is really tough. I could chat with you guys forever. And I know lots and lots of people from the feedback that's coming in have really been enjoying it and felt that they've learned quite a bit from it. It's always good to end with a positive. So I think I'm going to ask a positive question. Do best answer it. So what are the long-term strategies for creating a safer and more respectful environment online? Big question. When the internet started all those years ago, it was about sharing knowledge and connecting people, and we naively probably didn't foresee all the dangers and the risks that were lurking behind every corner. What can we do? The internet is a community of people. What can we do? I'm going to jump to Sophie first. What are your thoughts? Big question.
Oh, I was hoping you'd ask someone else first. Question. I think it comes back to some of the other things we've talked about around collaboration, but also looking out for each other, maybe calling out bad behavior individually. Sometimes we navigate our own safety, but we aren't mindful of other people's online. And actually, if we were all just that bit braver to intervene when we saw somebody else having a tough time online, that might help spread some of the culture, because we can all do that.
Braver, challenging, and working together. Lindsay, what are your thoughts?
I think I have a lot of hope for these new generations that are coming out. I mean, I will say, I mostly work with adults, but I do work with a number of young people. And I have young people in my family and in my community, and just hearing the conversations that people are having, even on, these very big online communities like Roblox, and people asking about pronouns and asking about, how people identify and supporting them. And I think just continuing, I think that young people have a lot of really good ideas and understanding around consent and what consent means and what it looks like in digital spaces in a way that I will say, I never experienced when I was, in middle school or high school. So really leaning into that, and also letting young people lead. I think so often we're teaching people, we're saying, oh, we need to go in and teach kids, and we do, but also let them teach us, because I think they actually know better how to utilize online spaces in a lot of ways than we give them credit for. And I have a lot of hope for the newer generations coming up.
Yeah. I think it's who we allow to lead us into the future with this is really key, isn't it? Adam, your thoughts?
Yeah, just to put a bow on that. Yeah, I agree with Lindsay. I think just focusing on youth to lead, and they're already in so many ways doing that. But I will say the sign that I see is when kids are telling their parents, hey, don't share that photo of me on your Facebook because I didn't give you consent. Parents are like, what the what? Like, where'd this come from? So they're actually learning about consent and teaching their parents, right? And that's exciting, right? So I'm hopeful for this sort of next generation of digital natives to lead us through sort of these digital challenges.
Brilliant. That is perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining today. It's incredible start of a conversation for us at Know More, but I know that you guys go on in the next couple of weeks and attend lots of different panels. You go to CSW, you're doing the Bumble Reclaim site. And I know, Lindsay, you'll be continuing your work. I think if you are interested in this and you're an advocate working in this space, there are lots of opportunities to learn more and engage in the conversation around this. I think we're at a critical moment where we're talking about it. So if we could get more people in that conversation, that would be great. We have another session straight after this. It's about technology created safe spaces for survivors. So that will start immediately afterwards. But yeah, thank you guys so much. We greatly appreciated it. Know More and loved every minute of this chat. Thank you very, very much.